So we'll try and let everybody join. Okay, so I'll start off kicking off then. Thank you to everybody who has joined us today. We're so pleased to have so many of you here for what is such an important discussion. So today's event brings together ourselves at Anti-Slavery International. So I'm Chloe Cranston, the head of thematic advocacy programs at Anti-Slavery International, IIED and OKUP. The three organisations have together for the past few years collaborated on strengthening the evidence and raising awareness on the intersection or nexus between climate change, migration and forms of modern slavery. This intersection between the three is poorly understood and remains underexplored. And this is why we've worked together to launch the Climate Change and Modern Slavery Hub, which we're so excited to formally launch together today. This hub is going to be a crucial resource for researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to learn more about this intersection between climate change, migration, and modern slavery, to support interventions and to support research and policy to make sure that the heightened vulnerability to modern slavery in the context of climate change is addressed. I'm not going to go into any further details now, as my colleagues are going to provide much more detail throughout the course of this event. Following our keynote speeches, which I'll introduce in a minute, we will hear presentations from Ritu Bharadwaj, the Director of Climate Resilience and Loss and Damage at IIED, on the findings of the Hub's research, and then Chiara Saletti, Climate Change Manager at Anti-Slavery International, on how to use the Hub. We will then move on to a panel discussion with representatives from Anti-Slavery International, IIED and OKUP, followed by Q&A with the audience. So please do start to get your questions ready and we'll be using the Q&A function. But first, before we go on to that, I'm so extremely pleased to pass over to two keynote speakers. Unfortunately, the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change, Elisa Morgera, was unable to join in person, but has sent us a short video presentation. We will then hear directly from Shakirul Islam, who's the Executive Director of OKUP, who will put today's discussion into perspective in terms of the reality of what's been happening recently in Bangladesh. So without further ado, I will now pass on to our first keynote speaker, the video from the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change.
On climate change and human rights. I'm sorry I can't be there with you today, as I was very curious to hear more about this new initiative, the Climate Change and Modern Slavery Hub. As I discussed in my first report to the Human Rights Council in July, there are many forms and scope of negative impacts of climate change and climate change measures on human rights that we couldn't expect, or still many of us may struggle to understand. For instance, the work of the UN Special Rapporteur on human trafficking has underlined the complex impacts of climate change on those dynamics. And other rapporteurs, but also submissions of information to my successive report on access to information on climate change and human rights, show how there are further unexpected impacts of climate change and climate measures, also on forms of forced work, forced migration, forced marriage, and these are compounded by situations in which climate is also inducing migration or internal displacement. In my second report on access to information on climate change and human rights, which I will discuss at the UN General Assembly on 18th of October, I've really stressed the importance of bringing together information from across different sectors and different lived experiences to make sure that we fully understand the risks and the impacts of climate change and climate change measures on human rights. And we are able to understand who are the most affected human rights holders. So this hub today that you're discussing and launching can clearly contribute to that understanding, which is essential both for public authorities to be able to have all the information needed for them to do their utmost to prevent further violations of human rights and integrate this understanding in the design of any future climate measures. But it's also really important for human rights holders themselves and civil society and all those that can contribute to the protection of human rights and working together. The other recommendation I made in my report is how important it is to co-develop this information, working directly with human rights holders and the communities most affected by climate change. And I'm curious to hear if this is the methodology used in the hub or whether you are planning in other ways to support the co-development of knowledge and information. We can really ensure that we value and understand the importance of lived experiences on the same level of importance as other sources of knowledge on climate change and make the best decisions we can in terms of effectively protecting human rights from the negative impacts of climate change and climate change measures. I look forward to staying in touch.
So thank you to Elisa Morgera for that, and we can definitely cover her queries about to what extent we have incorporated lived experience into how we've been addressing our work together on this intersection between climate change, migration and modern slavery. And actually somebody who'll be able to speak to that a lot, but probably more in the panel discussion, is our next keynote speaker. And we're so pleased to have him here today, given what a difficult context it has been recently in Bangladesh. So we're really fortunate he's been able to join us. So I'm so pleased to pass on to our very close partner, Shakirul Islam, the Executive Director of OKUP.
Thank you, Chloe. Dear colleagues and friends, very good afternoon from Bangladesh. It's my honor to speak in this kind of global event as a representative of the climate-affected communities from Bangladesh. And you all may know that Bangladesh is a deltaic low-lying plain having a long coastal area, which actually made Bangladesh is more susceptible to natural disaster geographically. But the climate change has heightened this susceptibility and increased the consequences and impacts. Just give me a highlight of the recent climate change impacts in Bangladesh. And very currently, right at this moment, we are actually experiencing a devastating flood because of a record of rainfall in our country. And this time 3 districts in the northeast Bangladesh have affected critically, and the flood has claimed the lives of 11 individuals till today, and affected approximately 14,000 families. And nearly 70,000 people have been marooned due to the rising water levels, leading to substantial damage, particularly to agriculture. And we know that 92,000 hectares of crops have already destroyed, and around 3,000 fish farms have submerged. And before that, in late August, actually, we experienced another devastating flash flood in the northwest districts in Bangladesh. And because of that flood, nearly 5.4 million people were affected, and the flood destroyed nearly 48% of houses of that districts. And it also damaged the crops of nearly 3,000 hectare lands, and so on. And if I go back to late May, it was Cyclone Ramel, and it actually hit 19 districts in the coastal area of Bangladesh, and the cyclone affected 3.8 million people, have completely damaged 35,000 houses and partially damaged nearly 150,000 houses during the time. And what I want to say that this is not only flood and cyclones. We have increasing temperature together with frequent heat waves, and we have also a rapid escalation of salinity in water and soil, and all have critical impacts on our lives and livelihoods, particularly, creating damages of our assets, loss and damages of livelihoods, and also well-being, which is very much important to ensure. And in response, we have number of emergency supports, but there is no sustainable long-term support and assistance to the affected communities. And that's why actually people depend on taking loan to rebuild their lives and livelihoods. But, they cannot pay off their loan because the next cycle of natural disasters come and put them into a dangerous situation. So that's why, the number of people are increasing who are falling into the debt trap. And our longitudinal research is saying that 58% people in our community are already in the cycle of debt trap. And when there is no other livelihood options or other means of life, then they are actually being forced to migrate. It's either internally and internationally. And our data is showing that 70% of households of that particular region in the Sundarban area have at least one migrant member in the family. And out of those, majority, more than 80% migrate internally in different districts inside Bangladesh. But a growing number of people are taking international migration to find a better livelihood. But what I want to say that when people migrate, there is no pathways for them. There is no legal protection because most of the cases, the migrant who migrate within Bangladesh, they engage in informal sector activities. And you know that informal sector activities in Bangladesh is excluded in the national level law. So that's why there is no protection for this kind of people. And that's why they fall into the trap of forced labor, restricted movement, waste theft, and so on. On the other hand, the people who are migrating outside, there is no pathway. That's why they are taking the existing labor migration corridor. And when they are taking labor migration corridor, it means that there is unethical practices in recruitment system. So when they are migrating with a huge amount of loan to pay the migration cost, they are falling into the trap of exploitation. And we have data that more than 80% migrants, when they arrive in the destination country, they are not provided their work permit, so they become undocumented. And when they become undocumented, they face different forms of rights violation, including forced labor, including restricted movement. Many of them are arrested and detained, and then after a certain period, they are sent back home empty-handed with the burden of loans. So when these are happening, there is no there is no protection, there is no support and services for the people, particularly the migrant people in our country. And that's a big problem. And it actually push this vulnerable community into further vulnerability and which lead them to an undignified life. And I will say that, yes, we are very fortunate to have partnership with Anti-Slavery and IIED under this project to do research to understand the critical intersections between climate change, migration, and modern slavery. And I think that would really be helpful for us to create more evidences, to do advocacy at different levels, including local, national, and international. So I really appreciate the initiative of Anti-Slavery International and IIED to launch these climate change and modern slavery happen. That would be really helpful for the organizations like ours at the grassroots level who have really lack of understanding about the intersections between climate change, migration, and modern slavery. So I really appreciate the initiative, and I hope that we will move forward with this resource hub for better understanding on the issue of climate change, migration, modern slavery. So that's all I will end. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Shakarul. The statistic percentage you said, about 58% of people being in a debt trap, is really startling. And thank you so clearly for laying out such a clear example where this is really happening. We're going to take a step back now and go back to the hub, which is more of this global view of the intersection of climate change, migration, and modern slavery. So with that, I'm really pleased to pass over to Ritu Bharadwaj from IIED, who's going to present the hub and an overview of the findings.
Thank you, Chloe. And I'm really enthused by the interest that we've received for this, the launch of this hub. And in fact, as we were just starting this program, Chloe and I, we were discussing that it was only 2 years back that we discussed even the idea of bringing together all the knowledge, all the research and evidence that we have on climate migration and modern slavery on one hub. And it's really good to see this come to fruition today. So to begin with, I'll say that we are dealing with a wicked problem and something that we are calling climate change. And we are calling it wicked because we don't understand it. It's unpredictable. And we can't solve a problem which we don't understand. And that's why we need something like this global resource hub. We know that many regions are facing unprecedented impact. Like, we all saw the news about Dubai facing floods for the first time. And we know that many new types and new forms of climate impacts are impacting areas where people are not even equipped to handle them. They don't know, they don't even have the technical know-how or the capacity or the finances to deal with them. Plus, most of these impacts are increasing in both intensity as well as frequency. And why all of this becomes important? Because of the scale at which it's occurring. We know that the latest IPCC report has noted that the greatest single impact of climate change could be on human migration, with millions being displaced because of shoreline erosion, because of coastal flooding, and because of agriculture disruption. And when people move without support or protection, they then become exposed to exploitation, to trafficking, and to other different forms of modern slavery. And, different reports and different papers have put different numbers to the scale at which this impact could be. I'll just quote the number of World Bank report, which said 216 million people are likely to be internally displaced by 2050. But this number would be much higher if we accounted for the cross-border migration, because you just clearly heard Shakirul mention a large population migrating from Bangladesh, which he termed as international migration. International migration is a good name, but most of these migrants are actually considered as illegal migrants, and therefore they don't have rights. So one can only imagine if 216 million by 2050 and many more added because of cross-border migration, the scale at which climate-related displacement would expose vulnerable communities to the risk of exploitation, and something that we all term as dark side of these migratory flows, where people become victims of modern slavery. But the problem with us is one of time, because we know the speed at which the climate change is occurring, and two, of the scale, because the number of people which are going to get impacted. So for addressing these risks across the wide range of national and local contexts where it's occurring, we need context-specific approaches. We heard the special rapporteur who mentioned that she's looking for solutions and methodologies that incorporate community perspectives into it. So because the policy responses have to be aligned with the on-ground realities. And to do this, there are two barriers. Because we ourselves, IIED and ASI, we came with one of the first groundbreaking research in this space. But we know that, and there has been a welcome increase in the number of research in this space, but there are still two barriers that we are facing. One, there's still lack of acknowledgement within the policymakers. At international level, we do see a little bit of recognition of this issue. But if you go at the national level, there's still a lack of acknowledgement within the policymakers of this link between climate migration and modern slavery. And two, and because it's not being acknowledged in many places, we don't have effective policy or programmatic responses to address them, which are both effective as well as timely. And I'll explain timely later on, and I'm sure it'll come up in question and answer as well. So with all of this context, when we created this global resource hub, we wanted to address these two critical issues. One, for when we started the global resource hub, we had three objectives. First, to create a hub which acts as a repository of all the relevant research and the knowledge which have been done not just by IIED or ASI or organizations like OKUP, which are our partners. We wanted to cover all the research which has been done by all institutions working in this space, which have tried to explore the link between climate migration and modern slavery. And we were hoping to cover all the regions and different types of climate impacts, both slow onset as well as rapid onset events, because we know the impacts of these two different types of climatic events are quite different. We also wanted to ensure that this global resource hub was accessible to all. And third, we wanted to ensure that we provided that actionable insight, a knowledge base for decision makers, for researchers or practitioners to help them understand what forms the impacts of climate change are taking, who is most vulnerable, and what kind of policy response should be there, either in form of social protection, disaster risk response, or other responses to address them effectively, adequately, and in timely manner. We also, and when we were designing this resource hub, we also wanted to ensure that, of course, we have now got generous support from UK Home Office to do this work, but we did not wanted this to be a one-time effort. We wanted to ensure that this became a resource which was constantly updated, and we kept adding new resources, new knowledge, because we know that new methodologies are coming, more and more local organizations are carrying out research, and even the nature of migration is changing. So we want to ensure that we continue to capture that. And in doing so, we would need your support, because a lot of this work will need to be done collectively through a community of practice. So I'll encourage you all to visit that resource. But I was also given this task to very quickly summarize the assessment of all the resources that we have. And very quickly, very top line summaries are, our research revealed that climate change is acting as a stress multiplier to a lot of other development deficits that are there in different countries and regions. So climate is not occurring in isolation. So it is very difficult to really extricate that this is the level of trafficking which is happening because of climate. But that impact, again, it would not be correct to deal that separately. It has to be seen in a combined way, because climate is interacting with development challenges and then creating that impact. So it needs to be seen in that context. Then second, people who migrate due to climate change are often forced to do so under dangerous conditions. And without proper legal or social safeguard, they then become victims of modern slavery or trafficking, because they are desperate to secure work and food and other support for their families, because for them, it's either it's a do or die situation. So either they stay there and let their families suffer hunger, or they move, even though they understand that sometimes it might be dangerous for them. On the country level research, some examples are there where in different contexts, different dynamics played out. For example, in Bangladesh, as Shakirul was saying, some of the cyclone and flood affected coastal communities have faced very high level of human trafficking. Whereas in many areas, like, for example, Cambodia, or even in India, where we were doing our own research in Palamu or Kendrapada, we have seen that debt bondage often pushes people into internal migration or displacement, where they end up working in brick kilns and agricultural field, working in forced labor or exploitative labor condition. But we also found that different vulnerable communities face different levels of risks. For example, women and girls in particular face heightened risks as migration exposes them to forced labor and sexual exploitation. Similarly, in case of indigenous and rural communities that rely on land-based livelihoods or natural resource-based livelihood, they are at a greater risks of being pushed into exploitative labor markets because they don't have any other alternate livelihood sources when they, their livelihoods becomes insecure because of climatic impact. Again, we saw in Sundarbans and Palamu region that trafficking into internal or some of these urban informal settlements was quite rampant. Now, the intersection of climate migration and modern slavery, what we also saw different types of policy response. So some of them were in the form of social protection or humanitarian organizations coming forward with response. But a big issue in all the contexts was the lack of finances, because many of the least developed countries and small island developing states do face that resource crunch, even though they understand that this needs to be addressed, but they do face that resource scarcity. So I know that time is limited. I'm sure you'll visit the Global Resource Hub and you'll find more insights. But in conclusion, I'll only emphasize that the Global Resource Hub is not just a repository of information. We see this as a tool for meaningful action. And our findings highlight that there is a need for a greater recognition of this interconnectedness between those three issues in order to even think about any action on them. And as we move forward, as I mentioned before, we'll continue to expand this resource, keep adding data, case studies, and policy recommendations. But we'll rely more on you, more on this community of practitioners to come forward and help us in this effort, because right now we do have some funding resource. But as we move forward, we'll have to think about other ways in which we crowdsource some of this data and information. So with that, I'll just close and pass on to Chloe.
Thank you so much, Ritu. Really useful to hear, particularly how you're connecting it to the current lack of policy response, and how important we see the hub to help drive the policy in practice. We need to address the interconnection between climate change, migration, and modern slavery. And I know we're going to discuss that quite a bit in the panel discussion. Just before we get onto the panel discussion, my colleague Chiara, the climate change manager at Anti-Slavery International, is actually going to show us all the hubs so that you all have a visualization of what we are talking about. So I'll pass over to her to show us the hub, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion and Q&A.
Thank you, Chloe. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to introduce the Climate Change and Modern Slavery Hub, a crucial online resource that explores the intersection or nexus between climate change, migration, and modern slavery. The hub, as mentioned before, offers accessible evidence-based information to help researchers, policymakers, and advocates to make informed decisions in these complex areas. One of the hub key features is the evidence map. This interactive tool visually presents regions showing how climate change is linked to migration and forms of modern slavery in different regions. You can see how the user can move around the map and click on specific countries to access relevant studies, whether it's about forced labor in Southeast Asia, like here, or climate-related trafficking in Africa, like here. The map has also a powerful multi-filtering option here on the right. You can filter by region, type of modern slavery, climate risk, and more to quickly narrow down the information you need. Let's have a quick look. So let's pretend that we are interested in women migrating, so we can narrow down that and see what information is already available. But then we want to narrow down on what type of climatic event we are interested in, and we are interested in slow onset. And then we realize that we are interested maybe in internal migration, so we can go on top. And here we go, and we can click on internal. And as you can see, the more we use all these filters, the more we can easily navigate and find the specific information we came here to find. Now, let's look at the overview and About page for some other key information. So overview page. In the overview page, you can further explore the Hub's findings based on the current uploaded resources and key policy recommendation as just presented by my colleague Ritu. The page also highlights any gaps in research that need to be addressed and the methodology we used to develop the Hub. From the same page, it is possible to access the resource library via this button. The resource library offers all website content in alphabetical list, which is helpful for those who prefer a more traditional research experience. Just like the map, you can use the same filters here to narrow down your research and easily find the precise information you were looking for. Finally, moving on the About page. You can find more information on the term modern slavery and its use here. And of course, information about the partners who developed this tool, like Anti-Slavery International, the IIED, and OKUP. There is also here, at the bottom of the page, as you can see, a contact form where you can contact us directly for any questions. So, going back for a last visual, as you can see, it's a really flexible tool that we hope you are going to use in your work. I would like to thank you for your attention and stress how the Hub is an essential tool for understanding the link between climate change and modern slavery. We are committed to keep it up to date with the latest research, and we invite you to contribute, as also Rito stressed. If you come across any relevant studies, please share them with us through the contact form that I just showed you in the app. Please explore it and feel free to reach us with any feedbacks or questions. And thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Chiara. And I now welcome Ritu back, Shakuro back, and then I'm also pleased to introduce my colleague, Christina Patriarca, the Safe Migrations Campaign Coordinator at Anti-Slavery International, who's going to join the panel discussion. And just to say for the Q&A, we'll also have Rashi Abalashi, Regional Coordinator from IIED, present to answer any specific questions in the Q&A. So you have a lot of us to come to on the questions and answer section, and I can see there's already questions coming in, and please do keep sending them. But to kick off, I'll give one question to each panelist, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and we should have a good 15 minutes for Q&A. So first, just to Christina, who, for everyone's context, worked extensively on the desk research behind the Hub. I know when you were working on the Hub, you particularly looked at how modern slavery is being researched and understood globally within this intersection of climate change, migration, and modern slavery. So could you unpack further what findings and gaps we saw on the current understanding about vulnerability to modern slavery in this context?
Yes, thank you, Chloe. To start, though, before answering your question, I'd like just to give a brief definition of modern slavery so that everyone here is on the same page. So at Anti-Slavery International, we define it as when an individual is exploited by others for personal or commercial gain. So whether tricked, coerced, or forced, these individuals lose their freedom. So modern slavery is an umbrella term that encompasses several types of severe exploitation, such as forced labor, human trafficking, and forced marriage, for example. So we know that when shocks generated by climate change events add to already existing vulnerabilities that can be individual, such as marginalization, or that can be structural, such as the absence of adequate protection mechanisms, risks to modern slavery heighten. So those who already experience a degree of vulnerability are not only more impacted by negative events of climate change, and also, but are also more likely to migrate, to be pushed to migrate. So as Shakiro and Rito also highlighted in their keynote speeches at the beginning of this webinar, the findings of the research of the analysis that we've done highlights that migration that takes place under distressed circumstances in the context of climate change can increase vulnerability to modern slavery. So based on the resources that we've analyzed, something that also emerged is that the brick kiln industry, the construction sector, and domestic work are the sectors most referred to as areas of work where people that have migrated in the context of climate change are severely exploited. The majority of the resources, though, that we've analyzed focus on human trafficking. So one of our findings, which is around a gap, is that there is a general awareness that communities are more vulnerable to human trafficking as a result of climate change, particularly when we look at rapid onset events such as typhoons or cyclones. But there is limited attention to other forms of modern slavery, such as forced labor or forced marriage. So when it comes to gaps, our analysis revealed that, as already said as well, there is a need for much more research on these issues to increase our understanding of the complexity of how modern slavery manifests in the context of climate change and migration, which results also in a lack of an acknowledgement of the links, but also in an absence of policy that enables vulnerability to modern slavery to continue to exist. So other gaps that have emerged are around the need to broaden the geographic spectrum of research. Among the resources that we've analyzed, the majority of the focus is on South Asia. So evidence on other regions such as Latin America is present, but much more limited, or for other regions such as the Middle East and North Africa is absent. So Another gap is really on recognizing the specificity of the vulnerability of certain population groups, such as indigenous people, people with disabilities, but also immobile communities, so communities that don't want to move or that are not able to move, and understand how they are particularly made vulnerable to modern slavery. So this has not been explored in detail, and little attention is actually given to the issue still. There is also another gap in an understanding of specific climate impacts and vulnerability at plays in different contexts, particularly when we compare slow onset events, such as in the case of prolonged droughts, and rapid onset events, as I said, in the case of cyclones or typhoons. So this is just a brief overview of findings and gaps. But also last point that I'd like to make is that really, when we look at solutions, we really need to root them in the protection and respect of human rights for people.
Thank you so much, Christina, particularly for highlighting where we need to see much more research and focus on in the specific types of modern slavery. I'll pass back to Rita because you touched on this in your presentation, and I can also see some questions coming up in the Q&A on this, so we can cover this now. So could you speak to what you see the main priorities for international action being in response to the intersection? For example, what would you be looking for policymakers when you're going to COP, or the implications of these findings for discussions on loss and damage?
Thanks, thanks, Chloe. And I would say I'll highlight both the national and international, Chloe, because they're both interrelated, so you can't have one without the other. So for me, the action starts at the national level, because even though the repository is a step in the right direction, we still need more grounded evidence just to understand, get a good sense of where the risks are and who are most vulnerable. And that evidence base cannot be generated unless we really support that ground level research, allow that grounded evidence to come, because only that evidence can influence the international climate policy or finance flow. And with that grounded evidence, what we really need to do is to influence the national governments first, to design social protection programs or DRR response in a way that addresses those risks in a more effective manner. Next, coming to your question, which is on international response. So one thing that we really need, because see, policies and programs need to happen at the national level, but where they need support is from international level is more on the aspect of finance. And two sources of finance that really comes to mind is one, loss and damage fund, which is recently being created, which is yet to get operationalized, but it's fast moving into action. And the other is the Green Climate Fund. But what we really need from them is not just funding, we need pre-arranged fund. Because it's no use providing fund after the impact has already occurred and after people have already moved or migrated in distress or got displaced. So we really need to provide that support even before the disaster occurs. And for that, we've been actively advocating with Loss and Damage Fund, with Green Climate Fund, to use early warning system, to use risk analytics. And that's why, as I said, national level response is important. So we can adequately understand where the risks are, who are the most vulnerable communities, so that once the early warning triggers, we know exactly who the most vulnerable populations are, so that these funds can directly release funding to those who are most vulnerable. Now, one can say, how is it even possible? But we have written a lot of papers, and we have explained, and we have been advocating with Loss and Damage Fund Board as to how exactly that fund can be triggered and directly transferred to the bank account or directly provided as cash transfers to the community most in need. And thirdly, I would say that it's not just enough to provide that piecemeal support as and when the disaster strikes. We also need International Climate Fund to build more longer term, because we don't want these communities to always be exposed to precariously to these impacts. So we need to make the agriculture, because, of course, there are two types of impacts, things that can be adapted to. So we have to put in resources, as much resource as we can do, to make those natural resource-based livelihood more adapted to the climatic impact. The second would be, there would be obviously risks which are beyond the limits of adaptation, which falls in the category of loss and damage. So if there's a sea level rise, people will be displaced, they will have to be rehabilitated. So don't wait for that to occur, rather preemptively take people to safety, provide them better livelihood opportunities in new areas where they are rehabilitated. So, but that cannot happen without the finances flowing into the least developed countries and small and developing states. That's it from my side, Chloe.
I think that's such a powerful point to emphasize the importance of getting the protection to the people before the harm happens. And when we, hear what Shakarul said earlier about what's happened in Bangladesh, we can just see to what extent that's still not happening. So to that end, Shakarul, last question to you before we move on to the audience questions. Could you explain, given your perspective sitting there in such a country that is so affected by everything we're talking about on such a day-to-day basis at the moment, could you explain how you would be using this tool or the evidence that we're bringing on climate, migration and modern slavery to support your local work and your work to advocate nationally to the government in Bangladesh?
Thank you, Chloe. I mean, it's really important questions how we can use this resource hub in our actions at national level and local level. And what I want to start with with what Ritu already mentioned, that there is a lack of acknowledgement about the intersections between climate change and modern slavery. Even I will say that in our context, in our country, even the word modern slavery is very much sensitive to use, because most of the cases the government stakeholders are not aware what does it mean, and there is a negative perception, what I will say. And we as an organization face difficulties when we submitted the first project on the issue of climate change and modern slavery to the NGO Affairs Bureau for approval. And then the government officials raised questions why you have used modern slavery term in this kind of project. Then, we had to negotiate. We had to make them convinced that this is the word and what is already mentioned in our constitution that was, adopted in 1971. And it's not something new that we are bringing from somewhere else. It is already embedded. So we actually invested a lot of time and energy to convince the government officials that there is no harm if we use, so they can actually approve the project to move on. So this is the reality, that yes, there is a lack of understanding about the whole terminology of modern slavery. So I think this resource hub will be definitely useful for us to know read the resources from different countries that Kiara has already shown that it's not only in Bangladesh. There are many research speeches from different parts of the world under this hub. So it will definitely give us a good opportunity to learn more from different countries, how they are actually looking at the interconnections of climate change, migration, and modern slavery. So what we are thinking now that yes, we need to undertake more initiatives to create more evidences on the interconnections with better understanding. For example, there is an indicator set by the ILO to understand the modern slavery. There are other indicators. So if we do not have this kind of understanding how we will define modern slavery, that would be difficult, right? So I think that we could use this resource hub to understand more on the issue of modern slavery, how we will term it, how we will define it according to the international indicators and so on. Then we can create more and more evidences to use in our advocacy at local level and also national level. And what Ritu was saying that it is really important to start at the local and national level, because if the local government and the national government are not aware about these and not sensitized, oriented, then it would be really difficult to bring changes in the policy. So I'm very happy that we have this kind of resource so that we can use in our daily work. Thank you. Over to you, Chloe.
Thanks, Shekhar, about making it so clear how we can make this actually hopefully create change at local and national levels. I can see a lot of questions coming in, so maybe we should have made the event longer than an hour. I do want to emphasize that we're all available for questions afterwards as well. So if you want to have a specific discussion with us on the hub, do get in touch. But I'm going to do my best to try and get through as many as we can now. And so to that side, I asked Ritu, Shekhar, and Christina to keep your answers short when you answer them. I'll pass to Ritu first for the one on social protection, which is, could social protection help reduce vulnerability to climate change and exploitation for people on the move?
Yes, Chloe, and I think my response will address a couple of other questions that are there in the chat. So firstly, for me, we work very closely on the social protection program, and I really cannot see social protection differentiated from the effort that we do on climate migration and modern slavery. Why? Because, and I also see the role of social protection not just in responding when the crisis strikes, but using it as a more preemptive tool for support to the communities before, during, and after migration. So very quickly, before migration, we really need to have that anticipatory and shock responsive social protection. And when we say social protection, when it's about livelihood security, health security, food security, a range of issues being covered through social protection programs. So communities should have that protection even before the crisis hits. And when the crisis hits, that entitlement within those social protection should be enhanced so that they can cover that additional protection. We also need to use social protection program to make the community prepared or migration ready for employment by enhancing their skills, providing them access to jobs or decent, safe migration pathways and jobs at the destination site. So I said before migration. So during migration, we also need to provide helpline services and other support through NGO and other government shelter support services to provide support to migrants during en route when they're migrating, because migration is something that is unavoidable. It would happen. It's about how do we make that experience more safe and secure so that people are taken towards opportunity and not distress. And for that, we also need to ensure that when they are at the destination site, that is after migration, that wherever they are staying, they have decent living and stay condition, which means proper access to housing, sanitation, and other facilities, both for them as well as for their children, because children are the ones who, when they move, they lose access to schools, and midday meal schools and other facilities. And we also need to see that when community are displaced and they move to another location, that when they are moving to the other location, they do not lose access to the entitlements within the social protection program, and that social protection entitlement should be more portable. so that it does not matter where they are, they still get access to their food entitlement, or their children continue to go to subsidized schools, or they get health access to health support even at the destination site. And we also need to move beyond, because we know that migrations are not happening within the country boundaries, they're happening beyond country boundaries. So there are some precedents of this happening in Africa, but we need to make sure that even when people are moving across borders, these social protection entitlements are provided to them through regional coordination mechanism within the government. So I'll just stop there. As Chloe said, that please reach out to us if you have any queries, and we'll be happy to respond to them.
Thanks so much, Ritu. On the point about decent work, I think this links to the question I was going to pass to Shakro, because I know that you do a lot on this at OKUP. The very first question we had was about where fair recruitment sits in this. So how to ensure fair recruitment of migrant workers in the context of climate change and post-disaster settings. So I'll pass that one to you to comment on where you see recruitment journeys and all the issues we see with recruitment in this story.
Thank you. I mean, it's really critical, I mean, to ensure the fair recruitment system. So, we have two levels of experiences. The one is internal migration, the recruitment through for the internal migration in country, and also recruitment, recruitment for migrating to other countries across the border. So in terms of the recruitment within the country, I mean, there is no hard and fast rule actually. So it actually linked with the local brokers who who are engaged in the process of recruitment. For example, in winter, most of the people from the Sundarbans region, the climate-affected area, they are recruited to the brick kilns in different districts in Bangladesh. So what we actually experience that there are many agents and brokers at the community level who actually propose them to work in the brick kiln, and they actually propose a certain amount of remuneration for their work or wages for their work and the duration and all these things, but there is no written document actually. So that's the thing that actually put people into exploitative situation, because when they are in the brick kilns, their movement is restricted and they are bound to work, and even they are forced to take the money that they actually offer at the end. And we have number of cases actually that who actually face this kind of forced labor situation, and and been what is called is recovered with the help of the police, right? So it's happening, but it's not only in the brick kiln. There are other sectors, for example, construction sectors and the day laborer sectors in Bangladesh. So there is no formal process in recruitment. But what I want to emphasize is that the number of international migration is increasing among the people in the Sundarbans region. And our research is saying that it was like 65% increase in 2023 compared to 2022. So it means that more and more people are migrating internationally. And, for these climate-induced people, there is no legal pathway, which is actually mentioned in the Global Compact for migration, to create pathways for safer migration of the climate-induced people, but there is nothing at this moment. So that's why the people take the labor migration, corridor, and the workers are recruited again. We have particular laws to regulate the recruitment processes, and there are also laws and policies in the destination countries. And most of the cases, it happens through the irregular or illegal supply chain, which we call sub-agents, agents or sub-agents, right? So again, there is no clear process, but the government of Bangladesh has set some steps to follow so that they are recruited in a safer way. But I will say that since the sub-agents are not regulated in a proper way, and also the recruiting agencies are not accountable and transparent in conducting the recruitment processes, the unfair recruitment and unethical recruitment are happening. And in many cases, the employers in the destination countries, particularly the individual employer, they also sell visas. So there is a visa trading process that actually put migrant workers in more vulnerable situation when they are in the destination country. Because just one example that
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to. I think we can see that we could have a whole other session on all the challenges on recruitment and where all the issues around recruitment fees and intermediaries feeds into this. I do want to give Christina the floor one last time to make sure she can answer one question, and then I'm going to have to close us up. So Christina, if there's anything else you want to comment on based on what's been said, but I also wanted, there's been some questions about the role of the media and then some questions about the role of the private sector. So I'll give you the role of the media. I'll come in with a little bit on the role of the private sector, because that's something that Anti-Slavery International looks at quite heavily, more broadly. And then we'll close up. But over to you, Christina, for last word from panelists.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
Very aware of time. I'll keep it super brief as much as I can. I would say that it's really important to obviously have the media paying attention to the issue and help us highlighting the vulnerability of modern slavery of people that are in the context of climate change and migration. Something that I will urge as well, though, is really moving away from a security and crisis language and really putting attention and an emphasis on the rights that are violated and responses of the states and other actors in ensuring the protection of people that are vulnerable. I can obviously talk to you more about this, but yeah, this is my first very brief response to this.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to just take the liberty just to say a little bit more about private sector to make sure we haven't not covered that bit. I think what everything Shakrul said already about the role of recruitment agencies and where employers sit in that, and a lot of what Ritu's also said about finance sits into that. But in terms of practical use of the hub, we would encourage any companies to look at this to understand where there may be people currently in vulnerable situations in their value chains, or people who may be at risk of becoming vulnerable. And for example, if you're operating in any of the sectors mentioned, to be considering that, or if you're a company in the agricultural sector, to be understanding the risks that the communities in your value chains may be about to face and how they may be pushed to migrate, and how to help make sure they have the protections they need so they do not become vulnerable. And Anti-Slavery is very happy to have discussions with private sector about how to think about operationalization, the information in the hub in that way. Just very conscious of time, we have 1 minute for me to do the close. I was asked to really reinforce the most important points from the presentations and discussions, and I'm going to just give a really top-line summary, which is that we clearly need to have more evidence, and there was a big call from all of us for more collaboration on that. And you'll see that my colleagues have answered quite a few questions in the Q&A about how to reach out, which evidence we're using. It's also very clear that we need the policymakers in the private sector and all the actors which have power, essentially, to take note of this, to recognize the issue and to incorporate it in. And I think, particularly from Ritu and Shakrul, some really important, powerful points about how to make sure we're helping the communities who are the most vulnerable or at risk of becoming the most vulnerable, particularly before the worst happens. So I'm just going to conclude there with a very big thank you to absolutely everybody who has been involved. It's everybody you can see here, but also Kiara, Rashi, and many others from Anti-Slavery International, OKUP, and IIED. We will follow up with everybody who attended with the recording, everybody who wasn't able to attend. And as already said, you're really welcome to get in touch with us to ask more questions. This is not the end. This is us very much beginning this, and we want to grow it and keep it going. So do get in touch, and thank you so much for joining us today.
So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, everyone.